The majority of the violence and the blood and gore in this film is actually in the beginning. In the opening scene is kind of a flashback scene talking about the Amityville murders. You probably already know one of the older children murders the rest of his family. So you see a whole family being killed. It's done in a almost off-camera kind of way, and most of it's implied more than actually visually expressed, which is where James Wan is obviously the master. He implies things more to build tension rather than explicitly express it. So you see a man lying face down on the bed, and then you see a bloody slash across his back, so you know he's been stabbed to death. Likewise, a woman, and then later on the children of the family are all lying in their beds, and then you see bullet wounds and blood spatter all over their backs. So, you know, that should give you an idea of, you know, the blood and gore. But really, that is the most bloody and gory scene of the film. The rest of the movie is very, very similar to the first film. And what I mean by that is it's the same kind of container where there's plenty of tension, plenty of build-up, a lot of suspenseful kind of horror, not so much the jump scare stuff, although there are more jump scares in this film than in the first one. So be ready for that. They are quite fun, because one of the things that's so great about this kind of filmmaking is the jump scares are always genuine. They're not sort of fake put on jump scares. You know, someone doesn't open a door and a squirrel kind of runs out. It's always a genuine scare. But likewise, they come from unusual and interesting and new places. It's not, you know, you don't open a door and there's a scary face. It's a little bit more textured and interesting than that. So keep that in mind when you go in. Now, the setting of the film, very much like the first one, it's a different case this time. This investigation by the Warrens focuses on the Enfield poltergeist in the UK. Now, if you don't already know the story, my advice to you is to not Google it or research it before you go in. Just go into this film and follow the story as it's told, because there's a few interesting twists and turns that happen in the sort of unveiling of this story. So you're better off, I think, not knowing what happens. And I'm not talking about scary twists, I'm talking about interesting narrative twists. So yeah, that would be my advice to you. What you do, the other violence that you do kind of see, and most of this is bloodless, mind you, is particularly one girl, one daughter of the family is terrorised. So you see her speaking in a demonic voice. You do see demons quite regularly in this film, and it becomes quite a familiar visual. It's not necessarily the jump scare stuff. Like, you get to know who the demons are in this film. So yeah, you hear these demonic voices or this kind of disembodied voice. You see levitation, people being thrown through the air and smashed. You see a young girl brandishing a knife. You see a man in a vision having his neck snapped very savagely backwards, and you see someone being impaled. One character has visions about an impending death, and those are quite creepy. But most of it, again, as I said, it's more implied and suggested, not actually seen. People are grabbed, there's, you know, all that kind of stuff, lunged at and throat grabbed and all those kind of fun things, and pinned to walls and that sort of stuff. Probably the other potentially upsetting scene is there is a young child who is possessed, and it's watching her mother deal with the anguish of that, watching her child in pain and being so helpless. There's also a suicide reference, a potential suicide reference, where a young person looks like they're going to jump out of a window to their sort of certain death. And again, depending on where your frame of mind is watching this film, that could be a little bit confronting. So that's pretty much sums up the violence and the gore. I mean, I should say, with the violence and the horror, it's fairly consistent and fairly frequent through the film. So it isn't, I don't mean to say that it just happens once or twice. It is very consistent. In fact, if anything, it almost becomes repetitive. It's the same sort of scares and the same kind of format through the whole film. Personally, I didn't mind that. I love being in the world of James Wan, so it didn't bother me having the same kind of things happen over and over again. But just so you know, there is a lot, and it is quite, you know, consistent through the film. It's the eeriness, that sense of dread, which permeates this entire movie. As for sex and nudity, there isn't really any sex or nudity. As I said, there was one character lying face down on a bed when they were, you know, murdered at the beginning of the film, and they happen to be shirtless. You see people in sleepwear a lot through the film, because obviously a lot of the activity happens at nights. And there's one kind of reference. A wife says to her husband, says something about, I'll, give you something to look forward to when we get home, wink, wink. But that really is it in terms of anything that might be called sex or nudity. Likewise with the swearing, the A word is used once, and there's a few, words such as bloody and wanker and butt used once, I think, each through the film. So again, no real offensive language at all through the film. And similarly again with the alcohol and drug use, no drug use at all. Alcohol, there is one scene where there's a group of people sitting in a London pub. So there's a pub or bar setting. You do see alcohol around the scene, but nobody actually drinks. So again, alcohol, drugs don't have a strong presence in the film at all. If anything, the other thing to talk about is the religious references. There's very heavy religious references in the film. Almost as strong as the demonic references are, there's also, I guess, the God references to balance it. The Warrens were very devout, and they did rely on prayer and faith heavily in real life, and that does show in this film. The other thing about the Warrens that I do want to say is that there's a very strong focus on their marriage in this film, which is actually quite nice to see that they were a very genuine, very loving, very caring couple, and it's quite nice to see that come out through the film as well. It's kind of like a sidebar plot. But anyway, that's a bit, the summary of The Conjuring 2. I do hope you enjoy it, and I really do want to hear what your thoughts are on the film. Enjoy.